Okay, in our last study we saw beyond a shadow of a doubt that God has an eternal decree by which the world has been, is currently, and will always be operating by. God has not left the world to be free from Him and run according to the will of the creatures, while God merely responds moment to moment to His creation. He does not have a general goal that He is trying to accomplish. Rather, God has, according to eternal counsel within Himself, eternally and immutably decreed whatsoever comes to pass. Indeed, all things have been predestined by His wise counsel. Thus, there is nothing that is free from His control. Were there something that were outside of God's sovereignty, that one thing could be the Trojan horse that destroys and prevents God from actually being God and doing His will. Were God not in control of the details, He could not guarantee the end result. Were God not in control, let's say for instance, of the events that led to Cyrus being born and named and freeing the Jews. I mean, that prophecy was given almost 200 years before Cyrus was born. Think about all that God had to be in control of in order to guarantee that a man named Cyrus would one day exist, free the Jews, etc. He'd have to be in charge of his ancestry, the parents that would name him, and then the fact that Cyrus would even be willing to free the Jews. God is certainly in control of all things, or else He would not be able to reveal the future through the prophets. And again, more fundamental, God would not be God, according to the prophet Isaiah. Could He not control and do all the things and bring about His decrees and His will? But, lest we bias our experiences of the world, we have to ask the question regarding God and evil. If God really does control all things, does that also mean that God controls sin and evil in the world? If He does, how are we to understand in what sense God controls sin in the world? Is God the one doing it? The problem of evil has long been the Achilles heel of theism, and Christianity especially. The problem of evil has kept many people from savingly believing in Jesus Christ or accepting the belief in any God at all, and forming a breeding ground for atheism, basically. The Westminster Confession of Faith offers the explanation in regards to God's decrees and evil, that though He ordains whatsoever comes to pass, the Westminster Confession says, this ordainment does not mean, however, that God is the author of sin. Now, how are we to understand this? First, we will answer the fundamental question of whether or not God is responsible at some level for sin and evil in the world. So, does God use sin? Okay. Does God cause sin to happen? Let's look at some scriptures and evaluate God's role in sin and evil. First, again, let's recall Joseph's story from Genesis. Recall that Joseph said to his brothers, again, Genesis 50 verses 19 through 20, do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God. But as for you, you meant evil against me. But God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Now, again, the clarity of the verse can only mean that God superintended every single action in Joseph's life to bring about the present state of affairs in Egypt, which was the salvation of many lives from famine. But when we look at Joseph's life, we take note that there was much injustice, indeed much sin, on the way to bring about the affairs as they were. What would have happened if Joseph's brothers had not hated Joseph for the implied meaning of his dream and had just let him be? How would the Pharaoh of Egypt have been able to prepare for the coming famine without Joseph there? How would Joseph and his family have ended up in Egypt? If they didn't end up in Egypt, how would the Exodus have happened? And so we see there's these events are connected together. Joseph's life was filled with much sinful influences. His brothers hated him. His brothers beat him and almost left him for dead. They sold him like a slave. They lied to their father about what happened to him. Joseph had to work in an environment that was ruled by a lust-filled woman. Her lust was so great that when she could not have Joseph, she lied about him and had him unjustly committed into prison. In all these sinful acts, Joseph explicitly says, God meant it for good. All the evil things that were intended by the brothers, God meant those things for good. God meant every detail of Joseph's life to be the way it was, both the good that was and the evil that God used to get him there. There is certainly no avoiding that in this text. Now, that God intended them to happen is not to say that God was the one committing these acts. We need to make that distinction there. A person can intend for something to happen without necessarily being the agent through whom it happens. We should also take note of the motive that Joseph reveals about God's intentions. God did not intend evil in Joseph's life just because or for no reason. That is, there was no purposeless. These evil events that happened in Joseph's life were not without purpose. They were not without reason. Okay? Rather, behind God's intention in using sin as the sinful motives of the brother to bring about a good state of affairs, not only for Joseph, but for Joseph's family, as well as Egypt and other surrounding lands that would benefit from Egypt's supply of food. Again, in all those evil things that the brothers meant, that Potiphar meant, etc., God used those things. He intended to use them in such a manner that he would bring about his own goodness and show his glory through them by providing food for everybody, by providing, in a sense, salvation. The story of Joseph is not the only incident in the Bible in which God uses human sin. We must recall that the greatest acts of God in redemption, the death of Jesus Christ, were also foreordained acts. Now, Jesus Christ, the Bible says, was always determined to be the Messiah. In fact, Revelation 13:8 calls him the Lamb slain from before the foundation of the world. Christians generally take comfort in this passage knowing that God could view the sins of some people in time as atoned for on the basis that it was ever in the mind of God that Christ would make atonement from the very beginning. Thus, believers in the Old Testament looked forward to an act that was already completed within the eternal mind of God. But the atonement did not take place in a vacuum, that is, without context, okay? Without a historical context. Rather, the atonement, in order to bring it about, took many sinful acts. Christ had to endure false accusations from the Sanhedrin. He had to endure being falsely accused of blasphemy. He had to be falsely tried and condemned. And finally, he had to be crucified by sinful men in what would be the most sinful act in all of human history, the murder of the Son of God. Did God ordain those events? Obviously he must have, for it was the redemptive act that the people of God had been expecting for centuries. Acts 2:23 says that Christ was delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God. Peter goes on to say to the Jews, whom you have taken by Jesus, whom you have taken by lawless hands, have crucified and put to death. Also in Acts 4:27 and 28, Peter is praying for boldness. He says this. He says, "For truly your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, were gathered together to do whatever your hand and your purpose determined before to be done." Who did God determine to do something here? He determined that Herod, that Pontius Pilate, that the Gentiles, and even the people of Israel would be gathered together against his Christ. They were determined by God to do that beforehand. The wickedness and sinfulness of all involved in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ was all predetermined by God. Sin is never something that is beyond the control of God. Evil is never something that is purposeless. The most glorious and sacred act of the atonement was only possible through the means of human sinfulness. Although God ordained the means of human sin as instruments to bring about his redemptive acts, it is clear from the Scriptures that God is not the one who is committing these acts of sin and these acts of betrayal. For instance, God, though he had chosen Judas to betray Christ, and we see that in John 6, verses 70 through 71, was not responsible for betraying Christ. Judas was. Judas used his own will, and of his own selfish desire for money, Judas betrayed Christ. Though God had determined to use Caiaphas and Herod and Pontius Pilate, they are accountable for their own choices, which they made concerning Christ.